I worked for a few years as an actor in on theater and on camera, and um, as a black actor, I think working in or trying to work in Hollywood and trying to work in theater, it really it takes you to a lot of existential questions and then a lot of questions of positionality, especially in the era of colorblind casting, where you're asked to inhabit a body that is normally typed as white, and you know that the audience sees a disjunction. Sometimes you can visibly, see or audibly hear the reaction of the when they witness this disjunction, and that's brought me to a lot of the questions, all kinds of questions that I have and that I want my students to have too. So many of my students, when I was teaching them, they had to fill out a little questionnaire about their characters, and they would, when they would write down what the race of the character was, my black and Latino students would put down white. I was like, oh, okay, that's something we need to address. Or you, when you were playing a character as a colorblind casting, is the character your color, your in my view, your positionality, or are you being asked to attempt to inhabit some other positionality?
I spent a few years working for GLAD and GLISTEN, so the Gay Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, the Gay Lesbian Straight Education Network, and actually doing media relations, which caused me to choose communication in the first place. But like being inside of a kind of identity politic nonprofit, and specifically doing the kind of work which was a spokesperson for these organizations, and having to constantly not only be out but package myself in a particular way for them, really was, I think, causes me to raise the very questions that I'm interested in my work now, and also makes me think a lot about the kind of how do you think about like identification, identity politics, and to kind of use Omar's idea about positionality. How do you ethically, construct kind of theory that allows for people to inhabit multiple spaces? And because my experience of being there showed me that that was a really, really difficult thing to do. And I was, consistently policed around, how I was going to present myself in those organizations.
Great. Could I ask if somebody would mind just grabbing Kate a cup of water, since she's just run back and forth? And I wondered if I could ask you, Riley, a quick question. That was fascinating, and actually both your accounts are really fascinating and instructive, I think. The only thing that puzzles me is, after that policing, why did you choose communications as a place to study?
I think it was actually, I was hoping to deconstruct the discipline.
Okay,
And,
yeah.
We'll see how that works out. But I think, coming out of, I in some ways, I think, do have a kind of sense that, because people feel like media matters, it matters. And,
Thank you.
The kind of practice around how media relations folks kind of take certain elements of communication theory and try to implement it, I think, in really challenging and problematic ways was what caused me to want to be in a program, so that I could kind of talk about the experience of how theory gets translated into these kinds of projects in ways that are actually quite hard for people to actually put forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's someone like, I think it's Keynes, who once said, the person who says that she or he is outside theory is probably labouring under an outmoded one that they've never heard of.
Well, it's the theory of some defunct economist, isn't it? Isn't that what he says?
Yeah.
Something about that, yeah. Sorry.
I think she's coming back to us. She's almost here, so we can just about hand over. It'd be lovely to hear from maybe one more person.
For about 2 years, I was a volunteer and an employee for KCRW, which is a rather well-known NPR affiliate in Los Angeles, and I was actually the assistant for a lot of the DJs there. I used to be the one who answered the phone during the music shows, and I would be in charge. Yeah, I did it I worked with most of the major DJs who were there at the time, and he was horrible. He was the worst one to work with. Terrible to work with. And And he always felt really competitive with me because he knew I was a music person. And so he would try to impress me whenever I worked with him, and it was never fun. The other DJs were much more. No, he's. You're recording this, so I'm not. Good thing I'm not facing the camera. But almost every question that I started that motivated me to go to grad school came from my experiences of working at that station. Specifically, how when I worked for the World Music Show, which was hosted by Tom Schnabel, and how rapidly the world music program music ended up in all the other areas of the station. So like, it would start off in his show, and then all of a sudden the other DJs would catch on to it, and quickly it would lose that mystique of being world music. It would do other things. And so, specifically, my questions about Brazilian music, I started from Bebel Gilberto. That happened when I was there. And so, most of the questions I ask come from my working with that. And who are the listeners for a station like that? And I'm starting with people who have a lot of money and a lot of time to listen to public radio. And so from a political perspective and a cultural perspective, that's where I started. Of course, I'm moving beyond that now, but look at my research and where I've been. KCRW is responsible for too much.
Anyway, I just wanted to start with a couple of reflections. I sort of envisaged this in the morning as being a kind of talk that we'd all have, and now I'm going to kind of start it and then, as we say, bugger off, which is not, very, very good of me. But therefore, I haven't got a kind of presentation, just a sort of few reflections, which I thought we might all discuss, and we'll have some time to discuss them, I think. But there's just a couple of things I wanted to say first. The first one is, it genuinely has been a real pleasure to meet you all and to work with you all for the last kind of couple of weeks. And I think, even on our almost kind of cynical moments, we should all acknowledge that one of the ultimately redeeming things about life is it does continually produce people that you kind of like and recognise and you meet for the first time. And it's just a nice thing about the world, often in so I really wanted to say that first. And the second thing is I wanted to start with, and I was thinking about this in Michael Keith's presentation yesterday, and I was thinking about this when Toby was asking about, as he explained now, how you brought the experience of kind of cultural work or work into kind of the academy, is a sort of question about not just what to do in policy work, but why would you do it in the first place? Why would you ever seek to kind of get involved with these kind of things? And I was thinking about that when Michael was talking yesterday. And I sort of came back to the points that I made, I think, on the first day when I was talking about why I became involved in these things, both of which remain kind of resonant for me. The first one was that, I am a big kind of cultural consumer in some ways. I read books and go to the movies and listen to music, and I care about these things, and I've, my life has been enriched by them, and therefore I have a genuine interest in how they're produced and what gets produced and under which conditions and why, sort of thing. Because I think you have it's a very direct relationship that you have to these things. And I thought Dick's presentation in particular, the kind of linking bit where he's talking about subcultures was, an obvious kind of example of that. But that's just one example. I think we all have probably come to being interested in cultural studies to some degree because we're interested in cultural products, really. And I think that's a real connection that we ought to keep in mind in some ways. That generally speaking, the reason why you'd ever do kind of cultural industries development is because you actually kind of want more or better or different cultural stuff to be out there in the world. Otherwise, sort of to do something else, I think, in a way. And the second thing is this issue about the personal experience, I suppose, for me of growing up, in a city when I did, particularly in Liverpool, undergoing, sort of massive kind of deindustrialisation and destabilisation. And when Michael's talking about the East End of London, yesterday I was thinking about this, and I think that we can't ever get away from the fact, however much we want to critique issues around kind of labour practice in the cultural industries, and however much we want to discuss issues of precariat, and we can't ever get away from the fact that for most people in the world that we live in, the notion of having to have a job and having to have good work is an important one. So I think that the issue of economic development in that broader sense and how do you deliver good, sustainable work to people remains a kind of progressive rather than a necessarily kind of contaminated challenge in a sense. Or it remains a challenge that we could think of in progressive ways. Is probably a better way of putting it. Okay, so what to do really? What does the kind of critically informed policy advocate or policy worker seek to do. I mean, there's just sort of 5 points, and it really won't take very long, so maybe we can have a chat afterwards. But I said when I talked, I think on Monday this week, at the end of it, I said one of the things that we do is that there is a growing kind of empirical evidence base in this area, and that there is more work that we can learn from in a genuine way about what works and what doesn't work. But I think one of the issues is, and it's really been very apparent in the last couple of weeks, is whether we can even agree on what the stable field of inquiry is, what it is that we would be gathering evidence on, what is the field that we are seeking to both study or do policy work on, or in a sense become engaged in. And I don't know if any of you saw the email that I sent out this morning about that piece of work that was done in New England. It was yet another of these creative economy pieces of work, kind of counting the number of people who work in the creative economy in New England. And I didn't have a chance to read it, so I don't know what methodology they used. But I was really interested to see that they'd said, in contrast to John Harley's presentation yesterday, we used to call it the creative economy, and now we're calling it cultural economy, and that's the new designation, and that's the kind of hip and trendy thing, and you must all call it this now. So I thought that was kind of really interesting reflection on some of the things that we've been saying, i.e. that it's not just one-way traffic, and there's some kind of policy reason, there's some political reason that's driving that in that instance. But just the very basic, simple empirical things about what are the sectors, industries, firms, and/or markets, as John would say, that are included in this field. How big are they? How many people work in them? What do they do? What kind of things count? And particularly, I think, after the last week's discussions, what's the kind of, what are the value and global labour chains in this kind of idea? What's the field of inquiry? I think there's a lot of very, very basic and advanced empirical work still to be done in this area to kind of stabilise the field in some ways. And we've talked very little this week about what I now understand to be administrative knowledge. Some of the things about kind of, and I know this wasn't what we were meant to be doing, and I don't think it is what we should have been doing, but it's kind of interesting. There's been very little talk about methodologies and how you actually might seek to do this work. I mean, a lot of people's presentations have been informed obviously by their kind of methodology. So we had kind of ethnographic presentations, and we had Angela's thing about biographies, both work biographies and the thing about the biography of objects. But we haven't had a lot of necessarily kind of conversation about the methodological issues that face a researcher in this area. And I think for the policymaker, there's a real question, a really interesting question about what should be done. I mean, even in an ideal world, what should be done within the academy, and what should be done kind of elsewhere, because one of the real problems about the research in this area is that so much of it has actually been done outside of the academy. It's the opposite in some ways of something like cultural studies, which seeks to have a voice outside the academy. The work on creative industries and even on sort of some degree of cultural industries has been dominated by people like me, and actually not people like me, people much worse than me, who have much less understanding of these things, frankly. So a lot of it's been done by kind of consultancies and policy research and kind of think tanks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's very short term. Most of it is very short term, it's done for very specific audiences, and it's done to produce a particular kind of answer. And therefore I think not only is it useful and important to have academics engaged in this for lots of other reasons, but actually there is a real need for a proper empirical research base to be developed in this, particularly for any kind of longitudinal, large-scale or international comparative work, which just doesn't go on funded by kind of governments and think tanks, and other than in places, there's some places like the sort of World Bank and UNESCO, but that's very specific. So there really is a kind of need for more empirical work in this area that is translatable to policy but not determined by policy. And I think that's absolutely a possible thing to do. I don't think that all research which is valid for policymakers has to be constructed only for policymakers, but there are possibilities for making work which is valuable for different audiences. The second point, I think, is about, which a really dominant theme of our couple of weeks has been this issue about labour. And I was really interested this morning in the discussion about academic labour. Because one of the things as a sort of non-academic or as a very, very part-time academic that always strikes you about academic studies of the labour market is that academics' own labour markets are so odd. And so their understanding of labour markets always seems to me to be conditioned by the fact that they themselves have very peculiar, very atomised, very individualised in some cases kind of labour markets. So I'm not saying that in a way to sort of diss the work on labour markets is done in the academy, just the academically. It's really useful, I think, for academics to bear in mind all the time that your own labour practices and your own labour markets are unusual and quite strange in some ways. But more than that, I suppose the real question is, how do we insert concerns about labour, cultural labour and the cultural industries into policy? Because this seems to me to be an incredibly important thing to do and incredibly difficult. And I think there are maybe three ways that we might see to do it, because certainly policy so far has taken very little account of issues about labour in the cultural industries. It's assumed that this kind of work is desirable, and therefore the end of policy is just to make sure the people who want to do this kind of work can do it. It's just the access issue. There's nothing else about it. And I think there may be three ways that we can maybe try and sort of make some sort of gains here. One is about the kind of global division of labour that we've been talking about, which really doesn't come up in policy discussions, except for places like some of the work that George was talking about, except in international fora like UNESCO. And there are in other fields, in other parts of the economy, there is more discussion about labour practices across the world, and fashion and the sort of the fashion end on one hand, and the kind of garment making end on the other hand, I think is one of the areas where this has been the case. But this isn't the case in routine discussions about film or TV. It certainly isn't the case in routine discussions about kind of the internet or music or a lot of other kind of sectors. So I think that sort of the kind of global angle on that, and therefore the understanding of all the people who work in the production of these kind of things and the destruction of these kind of things is important. I think there's another issue about, particularly, and this is particularly for sort of global north discussions of relatively privileged, and I use that term advisedly, relatively privileged labour issues, whereby one of the ways to do it is to tie it back into general issues about labour. I.e., not to say this is awful that this is happening to cultural workers because they're artists and therefore that's awful, but simply to have notions of what good work looks like for anybody, in a sense. And therefore one of the things that I tried to do in London is to tie in discussions about cultural work to the kind of living wage movement, which seeks to have sort of, and it's actually been quite successful in organising certainly London government and some of the big employers into sort of living wage kind of things, but it's very rarely applied, and it's incredibly difficult to apply this to the cultural industries where you don't have large employers and you don't, and things like that. But I think that particularly in sort of the European context where the public sector is an employer and a funder of these things, there is a responsibility about looking, treating them and making sure that conditions of labour are at least the same as they are for other kind of workers. And I think the third issue, and John sort of touched on this yesterday in what I thought was quite an interesting way when he said when he was talking about how we couldn't use industries as a term, which I don't agree with him, but he did say industries wasn't a very good way to understand issues of free labour, and I think he is right about that. That's my phone. It has to be my phone, of course. Nobody else would be so rude as to have their phone on while somebody was talking, but... Right, the only defence I have for that is I saw, what's her name, Baroness Susan Greenfield give a talk recently, and the same thing happened to her, so that's my only defence, sorry about that. So I think there's a kind of issue about how that there may be ways in which, because politicians and policymakers love the idea of kind of, they talk about it often in the way that John was talking about, well, not exactly in the way that John was talking about it yesterday, but free labour as being this fantastic thing which is about the user becoming the kind of empowered producer and breaking down the distinctions between users and producers and all those kind of things. So I think there's a way of kind of problematizing the notion of free labour and free work, maybe in a kind of policy discussion. The third one, I think, is a bit more tricky. We haven't talked about this much either, really, and I completely understand why not. But I think in policy terms, there's always an unanswered question about kind of aesthetics, and that we haven't really kind of talked about very much. And there's a kind of assumption in the kind of market, very kind of creative industry market, it's got that the only judge of quality or judge of aesthetics, in a sense, in culture is the market. I.e., if something's popular, it's good, kind of argument. And then there are, of course, the traditional hierarchies of high culture and low culture, and what gets public subsidy and what doesn't. And I just think that there's something interesting still to be done around the work about, I suppose, kind of pluralism and cultural democracy that remains undone. And as I was saying yesterday, remains, or the day before, remains particularly undone when all the people who are interested in these areas go off into doing kind of innovation work, and the other people retreat into doing, the arts and those kind of things. And the point that was made this morning, and I thought that, I was incredibly glad that I've managed to find Boris Johnson's talk about the immense superiority of European culture over any other form of culture, was that is the real danger. I mean, the point I think that you were making this morning about the return to formalism in the academy, the return to formalism in the academy versus the return to kind of arts for art's sake in policy work. I think there is a potential link between those kind of things. I think it's a kind of backlash. I think it's a retreat on both sides. I think it's politically informed, but not in a clear unidirectional way. But I think that is a genuine sort of danger that a lot of the work of 20 kind of 30 years can very easily be kind of undone. And also I think it's really important to understand why that has traction with people. Because the instrumentalization of culture, both for economic reasons and for sort of social, benefit, actually does leave lots of people feeling dissatisfied. I think questions of aesthetics have sometimes been under-addressed by other kinds of discourse, which don't focus on, what's good, what's interesting, what's better than that. How can we possibly make these judgments? I think they have been a bit neglected, and therefore they kind of take refuge in this reactionary, comfortable space of we know what's good for you and we need more of it, and that kind of thing. So I think there is still kind of progressive work to be done there, really. I think there's a more kind of pragmatic point, which is that if you are seeking to influence policy, and like the conversation that we had yesterday or the day before about why would academics seek to do this and should they be forced to do it and all this kind of thing. I mean, it's probably obvious from what I've said, but it's absolutely the case that most academics should not feel the need or the compulsion to get involved in kind of policy in this area. It's absolutely, people who don't want to engage in that way should feel utterly free, in my view, not to engage in that way. But I think if you are going to engage in that way, and particularly if you're actually going to teach something that's called public policy or cultural policy, then it's slightly strange to take a kind of totally sort of arm's length view of it. I think if you're going to get engaged, then you might as well engage in a kind of informed way, I suppose is what I'm saying, rather than anybody should feel that this is absolutely something that they ought to do. But when you do that, what is the thing that you wish to engage with? What's not only the field of study, but what's the kind of policy object of this? And it really varies from place to place, but even within a kind of European kind of social democratic state like the UK, it's actually sometimes hard to work out where culture and the issues about culture sit within government, just at a very basic level. I mean, we have a Department of Culture, Media and Sport, but I was part of a kind of advisory group to one of the things that they were doing about 2 years ago, and it was supposed to be looking at issues of infrastructure. And the whole meeting and all the people who gathered there spent all their time talking about education policy or transport policy or immigration policy, and actually none of these things the Cultural Ministry has anything to do with. So if you're interested in issues of cultural labour, who would you even seek to try and influence it? It's probably not the Cultural Ministry. It's probably trade unions or labour organisations or the ministry or whatever of kind of labour or employers. It's probably not. Likewise, if you're interested in issues of kind of migration and how that's changing the city, which are all the cultural implications of that, or of planning, of public planning, then it's not the cultural bods that you need to go and beat up and talk to. It's all the other. It's the urban policymakers and the education people. So I think the kind of the instability of the field is reflected in the instability of policy, and therefore the kind of multiple audiences thing. And you really need to think about what's the object of policy and what is it that you're sort of trying to do. And just the final thing, which has really come home to me over the last couple of weeks, is what's the possibility for doing genuinely good international research work in this area? Because I think that is one of the things that the academy has the possibility for, and most other places don't. If you're doing policy work within your own country or within your own city or locally, it's really important. But the chances are you're going to do it about that place. That's what someone's funding you to do. And if you're, doing cultural policy in Sweden, they might send you on a few jollies around a few cities to talk to some people and have dinner and say, what do you do here, and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, there's very little real international kind of work that underlies this kind of thing. So I think that, that is a kind of responsibility of the academy. But even within the academy, it seems to me that it's very, very underdeveloped at this stage. And I think that's to do with funding and the instability of the field and all those kind of things. So I think I'll just stop there. And we have got time for a bit of discussion, I think, before I run off. If anyone.
I have a question about an externality in the shift from using arts as a category to whatever you want to call it, cultural economies, or creative economies. And that is, what about the sort of historically women's work of arts administration? And what's going to happen, or what is happening?
In my experience, it hasn't ceased to be feminized, even though the job titles have changed. And that might be just my experience. And a lot of that's in, as I've said, within London. But and therefore, as I was trying to explain the other day, even though there had been this shift, there was still this kind of residual concern with who gets to do this stuff. And so most of the work that I do, most of the work that would get funded in a city like London, in this area, whatever it's doing, would have very explicit requirements about gender employment and ethnic minority employment. So I haven't seen women arts administrators lose their jobs and be replaced with male creative industry specialists. I haven't seen a change in which doesn't mean it couldn't happen. It doesn't mean it might not happen in any other kind of instance. And often that's what happens with kind of pseudo-professionalization of things. So I haven't seen a gender shift, but it is definitely worth kind of keeping an eye on, as it were, because there clearly is a kind of shift. And what I've found is that most of the people who do arts administration, there's a kind of nervousness and there's a sort of sudden desire to learn new language. And as I was saying the other day, I think that's a very reflexive process. Mostly people who work in the public sector, in my experience, are fully aware that every 2 or 3 years they're going to have to learn a new vocabulary to re-describe what they've been doing for quite a long time. And that what they're doing might not actually have changed, but they have to call it something else. And it's a very conscious process. And you sit down in meetings with people and they say, we used to call this X and now we have to call it Y. And everyone nods and say, yes, it's Y. And so, you know, that goes on all the time. And so I haven't seen it as a kind of purge or in that sense a kind of structural change. But it doesn't mean it couldn't be, I suppose.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to ask about your last point about the potential enabling role for academic research in relation to international comparative kind of work. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and perhaps suggest some, some ways of doing that and methodologies.
In terms of methodologies, I'm not sure that I can, beyond saying that what I mean is it's not going to go on anywhere else, really. It's the kind of thing that the Academy still funds, and it's really the kind of international work that goes on in sort of policy terms really is that sort of best practice kind of stuff. It's, I'll take 10 lessons from what happened in Bilbao and I'll go to 4 different cities and I'll tell them what happened in Bilbao. It's that sort of level of stuff, and it very rarely actually engages with what's happening on the ground, which is, of course, the classic kind of critique of Florida's work, and which of course he did do in the Academy. So maybe the Academy doesn't exactly deliver differently on this one, but you know what I mean. There's a sort of best practice dialogue that you can just take, that kind of cookie cutter thing you can take from one thing to another. But the actual genuine empirical work that's done on the ground in places rather than just done in one place and kind of exported, I just don't think it goes on anywhere else. So that's why I'm saying it's a kind of responsibility of the Academy. Not that it's necessarily happening a lot in the Academy, or that and I don't know what the methodological implications are, because I think there are lots of different ways of doing that kind of research. I just think that's the only place that it's ever going to happen, in a sense.
I have just a comment. Okay, I totally agree with the point that there is a need from research and work that doesn't come directly from the policy makers, and I want to know if you think that work like that of Patricia Aufderheide, that is a researcher, a scholar, but also a practitioner. She's a television producer, and also she writes and do a lot of research on policy. If you think that's enough, or do you think that more is needed in that way, in order to produce not only ideas for future policies, but also research on the field?
I'm not familiar with the particular work, so you might want to tell me a bit more about it.
Of Patricia Aufderheide?
Yeah.
Well, she's basically working in policies pro or to defend let me rephrase it. She's working on media consolidation and issues of localism and issues of basically ownership in media. And she is departing from her own experience as practitioner and obviously mixing that with her work as a scholar in order to produce a lot of material that is used either for policy consultation or for the creation of policy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the kind of work that's done by practitioners or activists or kind of social movements, I think is incredibly important, but it sometimes suffers from the same kind of criticisms that you'll get of consultancy work from a different kind of, a different kind of ideological standpoint, but that it's done for specific purposes and it's done fairly short term and that it lacks methodological rigor. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's the criticism that kind of thing will often attract. And because this is an area that's so full of not very robust empirical work, then I think that although all those things are important and absolutely need to go on, there is something that can be done in academic research, I suppose, that can't necessarily be replicated exactly elsewhere, although I think all those other voices, and I think, I don't understand people who do work in this area who either never read academic research or only read academic research. I think it's in culture, it's a very bizarre. The best thing I read on when I was doing my project on artists, apart from Simon Frith's book, which is an academic book, but I was doing a project on artists and the formation of their links to British popular culture, I suppose, graduates from art schools. The best thing I wrote was a book by a journalist it was a biography of Roxy Music. Really commend it to all of you, by the way. It's Michael Bracewell's book called Remodel, Remake, and it's an incredibly intelligent and interesting account of the formation of that band within art schools at the time. They were their educational kind of formation, and I haven't read anything else on education that explain or even on place. There's a great description of Brian Ferry in this particular shop in Newcastle in Britain, and it's just a fantastic kind of, and I don't think Bracewell would ever describe this as kind of ethnography. It's not really an ethnography, it's a kind of very high quality popular journalism almost, but it's just fantastically rich and interesting, and so therefore I think the more kind of different sorts of work there are, the better. But I still think that there's policymakers like something. It's a Florida point made the other day. Policymakers do pay attention to academic research because they think it's more robust. They might ignore it for lots of other reasons, but that kind of stamp of approval, that kind of credentializing thing, is quite important to them, and therefore there's no substitute for that. Sadly, although I always tell them to read Michael Bracewell, but they're not going to listen.
I don't know exactly how to articulate this, but first of all, thank you for again kind of getting us back on some type of a track. But I think your last or your third, I guess, point on aesthetics really resonates with me in particular, in light of not only watching yesterday's film and kind of hearing the name of propaganda pop up, thinking about Riefenstahl, kind of that mass politics and the aestheticization of politics that, we talk a lot about at the Academy. Also thinking about the Olympics and that pageant and how that's kind of haunted a lot of our conversations. I guess I'm curious, I understand how that plays itself out in different ways in the academic world. Also how some people talk about I don't know, certain aesthetic rituals or whatever, and that typically associated with politics might be on, the out as more and more people are finding voices for themselves from their bedroom on YouTube, or I don't know. But I'm curious, in a policy arena, how this conversation gets played out. Do they talk about aestheticization of politics? Are they worried about, a particular moment in European history? Is it just Boris Johnson talking about, the good of European culture? I don't really know how to articulate this, but I'm curious where that fits into.
It hasn't fitted in for quite a long time. I think policymakers get really nervous about questions of aesthetics nowadays. I mean, there was one time when the only thing they had to say about culture was what Boris Johnson had to say about culture. That was the only thing that they ever said about it. And then for a long time they stopped saying anything about aesthetics, as it were, anything about those kind of things. And the British one-time Minister of Culture and now Minister of the Olympics, a woman called Tessa Jowell, about 4 years ago wrote a piece, the title of which I now can't remember, but it was the basic argument was we need to return to these questions of kind of, she didn't call it aesthetics, but we need to return to questions of what kind of culture and questions of actual sort of cultural judgments and all those kind of things. And it's not a well-argued piece, but it was kind of interesting that she'd felt the need to sort of return to this because she was sort of saying instrumentalization of culture for economic and social reasons has gone so far, and actually there is this kind of unmet need for actual discussions of, you know, other kinds of value that we might understand and place on culture. And so her argument is an incredibly unintelligent, I think, and uncritiqued one about complexity. She ultimately comes back to the fact that the market will not produce sufficiently complex culture, and that's where the state needs to intervene, which strikes me as ridiculous, frankly. But anyway, so that was kind of greeted with sort of concern and a bit of sort of, you know, why are politicians talking about this? And I think the problem is that nowadays they really lack the language. The delegitimizing until Boris Johnson brought it back of that language of kind of high culture leaves them without any language to talk about questions of kind of aesthetics and really the only really interesting thing, there was a really bizarre, again, British, in this case, high Tory politician about 2 years ago gave a speech which was called Politics as if Beauty Mattered. And it's about why we don't pay attention to questions of beauty anymore and why this term has become so totally removed from any kind of political discussion and almost any kind of discussion. And he was talking about issues to do with urban regeneration and on all kinds of social problems, but he was describing them in terms of beauty and ugliness, and it was really kind of strange and interesting, but attracted lots of attention because of that, because there's no acceptable vocabulary for talking about these kind of things in a way that's both pluralistic and democratic, but also has some notion of the kind of things that people do develop concerns about, I think, if that makes sense. So, well, does anyone have an experience of taking academic research that they've done into a kind of policy arena and how it's been received or not received or... Well, I know that you do.
I guess it's still in the realm of academia, but I worked with ArtBridge when I was at UC San Diego. I don't know if you know this, but it's an organization that coordinates the work of UCSD students with public schools in school districts. Mm-hmm. And I developed a program that has since, it still survives. It's at UC Irvine right now. I forget the name of the program, but it just got a $250,000 grant. No. It's through ArtBridge still. I don't know. Great. Yeah, we petitioned we applied for a grant from National Geographic, which I guess took us outside of the realms of academia. But the entire idea of the project was to teach social sciences through music. So we brought a lot from the discipline of music into the way that people learn in elementary schools, and that was really challenging to figure out how to teach everything but reading and math through music. I don't know, and Carrie Ann has taught it but also, so she could probably talk about it, but I just raised my hand because no one was.
Well, actually, I was a journalist for 5 years before I took up this research. So I was a reporter in a newspaper, and then I went to a television channel. And so I got interested in academia precisely because I love journalism. Not because, I love theories, and that's why I have to do something about journalism. So it's the professional experience that asked me to kind of engage with these theories and do research on journalism. And we had organized a consultation at our institute about social science research and how it is shaping up in India, etc., etc. The question was precisely this. I mean, where do you get your research questions? I mean, do you get them from the literature you read? Of course, literature is important, but the question should pop up from the field. And if they have to pop up from the field, your heart should be in the field. mean, that's how I see it. I have a very, very strong, deep relationship with journalism. I feel that newspapers I got really frustrated inside the newspaper industry, and that frustration I did not, I carried. It's just that frustration itself motivated me to constructively engage, with the criticisms about journalism.
Yeah.
And after having come to the academia, I haven't stopped contributing to journalism. In the sense, I still have a column, so I write it. And I feel that in my own way, I'm paying back to the profession what I'm learning in the academia. And in some sense, I don't know, I mean, I haven't done a great thing, but in some little ways, journalism is getting enriched through what I also teach sometimes, to journalism students. So my heart lies there, and I think that's very important for any kind of honest, passionate research. If there is no view of the field, and if your heart does not lie in the field, you just take very dry academic questions. You can be an intellectual, but you cannot be an academic.
There are two levels in which I can share my experience. One of bringing my experience in the business workplace into my experience in academia, and then the other way around. First, I'll just say, a lot of you have been talking about the really, experiences that have led you to think critically about the work that you have been doing outside the academic realm, and brought that into the academic space. But I think also on a very sort of pragmatic level, I learned how to write by being a direct mail copywriter. And that was an incredible experience for learning for really improving my writing skills. It was excellent training, and that has been invaluable since I've come to grad school. But then the other way around, I find that things don't often translate as well. In my experience working at the corporate headquarters of a book retailer, while I was preparing to go to grad school and taking coursework and thinking about what I wanted to do and all that sort of stuff, I was finding that my beliefs, my attitudes, my opinions, my knowledge around issues of race and ethnicity was really changing and developing, and I wanted to bring that into policy at my workplace. And so I joined the Office Diversity Committee, which, as I was soon to discover, was populated by a lot of white middle-class women like me. And I saw that the kinds of things that they wanted to enact is in their efforts towards, creating more greater cultural awareness across the different racial and ethnic groups in the workplace, amounted to things like having around the world food days and stuff like that. So I suggested that we consider developing, because the academic space has been so meaningful to me, I decided that wouldn't it be great if we brought in faculty, we're right by, a number of universities. We can bring, faculty speakers in, and we can have a whole series of colloquia. And then we could do like a reading group and all this sort of stuff. And everybody really loved the idea until they had to face, actually what, these people were going to talk about, or what the content of the books was. I mean, it was a huge fight for me to push through getting, I don't know if you guys know the Chris Spuhallen book, Transistor Radio. This is a book retailer, and they didn't want, in our reading circle to include a book that had content about, transsexuality. So it was because that was just too, racy, and when one of the faculty speakers talked about, the whitewashing of history, that person was immediately nixed. And so I found that it was very difficult to bring the information from the academic space into the corporate environment, and that was a real disappointment to me.
Okay, I'm also someone who decided to do a PhD to kind of understand certain frustrations. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've kind of done a bunch of different things, but when I think about stuff that relates to the PhD work, I mean, okay, I've been a staff person and a volunteer and a board member of independent arts organizations for a while, and so that actually it means engaging with bureaucracy, because I mean, this is mainly in Canada, and so a lot of these organizations receive a lot of state funding. But what happened is that what was happening, I started to see more and more, was that these organizations are being basically micromanaged by the Arts Council. But what was even worse was that I remember being at a meeting and someone said we should it was a media organization, and people said we should organize screenings in a way that the Arts Council will give us more money. And I thought, wow, this is really kind of the kiss of death here. I mean, it's not about thinking about what you want to do and then we think about how we get the money and so on. And I started to realize that just the way that people had kind of internalized the kind of view of the they've internalized the values and the attitudes of the state, and this is why it was interesting to read about governmentality later on. I mean, and then what was also, and kind of out of frustration, I mean, after this experience, I ended up, some friends and I tried to start an independent arts organization. We rented a space and we had parties and sold beer to pay the rent, basically. But what happened was, at the time I was teaching part-time in an art school, and a lot of people didn't understand why we were doing what we were doing. Why would you have this kind of organization? Because, I mean, the reason why we did it was because we wanted to do all the kinds of things that the state-funded organizations weren't doing, because they were being micromanaged, which meant a lot of we're sort of working with a lot of communities. A lot of the people in our group a lot of them were kind of community activists, and we're trying to, in some ways, allow for a kind of a broader kind of sort of cultural production that was happening at sort of arts organizations. But then a lot of the students at the school where I was teaching, a lot of them weren't really interested, because they thought that being involved in what we were doing was bad for their careers. And so what this all taught me in many ways is that, the ways that the arts are not autonomous, but also it made me really think about the kind of careerism I saw more and more in the art school, and how this connected with kind of sort of neoliberal ideologies. I mean, so that's there are other experiences. I don't want to go on and on. But anyway, doing the PhD was a way to try to understand that. So it is like you, it's also a kind of concern, for the field and worry about kind of what is happening with culture. I mean, and who is it for, and so on. Anyway.
And has it helped?
It has helped. So far, yes, it has. I mean, in the sense that I've realized that my experience was not unique.
That's always comforting.
It's comforting. I mean, and what I'm really hoping is I can think of strategies about what to do, but we'll see.
I was going to say that I was once an African-American lesbian mother of two, but I don't think that's going to fly. So one of the things that I've done and discovered, because I took an administrative half-time position at the university, I become more visible, and that's much more available to the institution. And of course, they want to take advantage of that availability. But it has also meant interesting challenges to apply my specific disciplinary knowledges to that kind of policy work within the institution. And I've discovered, probably because I have never really fly high enough to be able to call the shots and really do policy, but I discovered that at the committee levels, at the university levels, policy oftentimes mean having little battles that, however little they may seem, really have important consequences down the line. Like I was thinking of 2 or 3 examples. One was in a committee about how is it that the university presents itself towards the outside world, basically website interfaces. And I discovered, because we were assigned this duty of analyzing the different websites of the university, that while we had incorporated the discourse of multiculturalism, and every single one of our pictures was multicultural, they were all multicultural in the same way, meaning that there was a white woman or a white guy, mostly a white guy, in the middle, oftentimes a professor, in the middle, surrounded by the multicultural degrees that always ended up in some black guy at the very end. And so I said, and I tried to explain this. I don't think there was any conspiracy behind this, but it's simply the way in which the discourse of multiculturalism had actually landed at the institutional level. So I explained this logic, and to my surprise, it was changed. And after a year or so, it took quite a while for this to change. It doesn't happen overnight. But over a year or so, most of our pictures enter into a different kind of logic that continued to be multicultural, but didn't produce a hierarchy within multiculturalism. I thought, well, not bad. Another one has been, for example, determining the prompt that we offer the students that are applying for financial aid at the high level and at the low level. And this prompt, however absurd it may seem, basically it allows us a chance to have one more factor to decide who gets money or not, other than, you know, scores, GPAs, and all that kind of thing. And that little prompt, which is basically a three-liner, is incredibly important when assigning public resources to students who may or may not need them or may not deserve them. So the prompt used to be at one point, what's an education good for? And over the years, with the impact of multiculturalism and the elimination of affirmative action, the phrase, give us some examples from your own life, if you want, was added. Well, at one point, some faculty started questioning the usefulness of this add-on, because in the words of one chemistry faculty, we don't want to know about their experiences, we just want to know whether they can think and write. Which I thought, you know, is an argument. So I fought the battle of how do you bring this back into that, saying that it is important for the institution to have diversity inside and for the institution to fulfill its public mission without necessarily saying, I'm in favor of affirmative action, which is a no-go at the official level. And so fighting that little battle about the prompt, for me, it's policy making of the kind that matters in the long run, although the change is minimal.
Actually, I was not going to make any more comments because I already talked several times about my experience. But I'm going to say something new this time, so that it be not so boring. Actually, I was a quasi-professional singer, and I am a creative writer, write poetry and short stories. And I hosted 2 radio shows and 1 TV show on books, reading, culture, and all that. Yeah. And when I was already trained as a comparative literature person, but then after I went back to Taiwan, these experiences as an artist, as a creative person, like, you know, the few, you know, speakers who already told us that, you know, I had the same kind of frustrations and problems, you know, before I went into academia. So after I went back to Taiwan to teach, I gradually moved into cultural studies because I wanted to somehow solve the problems, you know, overcome the frustrations that I had encountered when I was an artist. So originally I was just going to somehow conceive politics from the sort of Adornian kind of perspective. Yeah. But then gradually it turned, you know, into a cultural studies kind of politics. And this cultural studies politics paved the way for my later on, you know, becoming the Minister of Culture of Taipei City. And what I wanted to say is that policy, like you said, you know, no one should be forced into doing policy, and I actually stumbled into this field, you know, very haphazardly. And what I like to tell you is that, you know, during that 3 years and 9 months, the Department of Culture covered wide range, from like heritage, you know, cultural subsidy and all that, all the way to protecting old trees in Taipei City. And I realized that I could do a tremendous amount of things to help to help, for instance, people overcome the problems that I had encountered before. For instance, let me just give you one example. Kirsten, right? You mentioned the kind of frustrations, which one is the lack of space, and in Taipei City too, real estate is very expensive in Taipei, and rent runs very high. And so, what I try to do is we renovated a lot of these public construction, public housing owned by the city government, which were abandoned actually because they were too old. And so we renovated all of these, as many as possible, and give them free to the art groups for them to use as studios, as places to practice, to rehearse. But the Department of Finance, they did not allow us to do this. Did not allow us to give this space to them, distribute them free, for free, without charge. They said you have to rent them to these people. Otherwise, it's against the law. But the thing is, if you rent them to these people, the rent is about as high as in the private sector. So in the end, after a few months of struggle, in the end we came to the agreement that okay, these groups could have these spaces for free, but they have to give community service in return. Do performances or lessons, workshops to the local people. And in the end, it was a happy ending. But it was done not without a long process of struggle, of negotiations and all that. Yeah. But if I did not come from this particular background that I did, I had, then nothing of this would have actually happened, or nothing would have happened that easily or that early in Taipei City.